Pleasure to join you today, and thanks, Julio, for inviting me and for that nice introduction. So what I want to talk about is a new paper. It's called A Calculation of the Social Returns to Innovation. It's joint work with Larry Summers. And I'll jump right in. The question here is, does society invest enough in innovation? And here I mean science, R&D, new venture creation, innovative activity, the whole innovation ecosystem. And, of course, innovation is valuable. We know that. We know science is valuable. It's not, are they valuable? It's are they valuable enough to justify the cost of what we invest in those activities, right? So to answer a question of social benefit, we need to understand the social return, right? We have to measure the social benefits from innovation investment and then compare that benefit to the costs of that innovation. Now, this is a subject, what are the social returns to innovation that economists and others have studied for a long time. And it's hard. It's really hard, okay? And just to give a couple examples of why this is so hard, is just think of a few, say, innovations, whether breakthroughs in science or more practical marketplace innovation. So here I'm showing you on the left, Einstein's equation for general relativity from 1915. In the middle, I have an image of Taq polymerase, the key enzyme that's at the heart of DNA replication, and then at the heart of all of sort of the modern health improvements and market gains from the biotechnology industry. And on the right, of course, I have an iPhone. If you think about any one of these, and I asked you, what is the social benefit from that thing? I think you would realize that's kind of hard to say. I mean, Taq polymerase, the whole biotechnology industry, how do I think about that? Or the iPhone, we use it in so many complicated ways. How do I begin to think about its benefit? Do I just look at Apple sort of benefit from it? Well, that seems like a small part of the entire ecosystem, say, that smartphones have created. Okay, so why exactly is this so hard? It's hard because when you talk about innovation, we tend to think that a new idea or a new thing, its benefits spill over in many ways. And sort of in some ways, the more important the thing, the more diverse those spillovers are. So I'm picturing again here the smartphone, an Apple iPhone, but just to help demonstrate some of these. But so what are these sort of spillovers, right? So to an economist, markets sort of get things right when sort of the private value of the thing is its value, right? But markets get things really wrong if the private value of the thing is not the value, right? So that could be in a negative way, like pollution. So I might use a lot of fossil fuels, but I don't account for the fact that it's creating, say, global warming or perhaps acid rain or something in power plants. Then the market sort of value of coal or market value of fossil fuels is not correct from society's point of view because of those pollutants. With innovation, we tend to think it goes the other way. We tend to think that an innovation might give some private return to the innovator, but its value might be much, much larger than that in a positive way. So Taq polymerase, for example, a scientific insight, that provides almost no private market value in its own terms to the people who create it or discover it, but it provides enormous social value eventually through various kinds of market innovations and health advances. Taking the iPhone, so what's one kind of spillover? Well, it's intertemporal spillovers. When you create the smartphone, that creates value for Apple, but by having created this platform, there's hundreds of thousands of developers who create now millions of software applications that run on smartphones, and they capture an enormous amount of value in the future from the fact that the iPhone was created by Apple. So those can be very positive. There can be positive spillovers. It could be negative. It could be that if I find an idea and I discover it, I know no one else in the future can discover that idea. So I make it harder for you as a future innovator because I've sort of come up with the idea myself. That's another kind of negative version of that. There can be imitative spillovers. So Apple comes up with the iPhone, but then Samsung's going to come up with a competing product and start taking market share and taking value from Apple really very quickly. There's business stealing, right? So I might be tempted to say, all of the things that come up with the iPhone and all this system of apps and everything on top of it, it's all kind of augmentative for society. But of course, that's not actually true, right? Because take Uber, for example, that's an app that runs on a whole business model, Uber or Lyft, that run on smartphones, which allow the driver and the rider to find each other. what happens with Uber? Well, Uber is a very successful business, but of course, a lot of its growth and gain is coming at the expense of taxi companies, right? So a lot of the gain for Uber as a private company isn't actually augmentative to society. Some of it is, but some of it is just business stealing, shifting value from taxi companies to Uber, or Amazon shifting value from, say, bookstores to Amazon. A lot of Amazon's growth is going to be at the expense of other companies, and so that's not really augmentative for society. So that's sort of a negative effect of innovation. You're kind of stealing business from others, and that might cause the private returns to be actually too high compared to the society's gains. There's also a duplication problem. If you and 6 other labs are all going after the same thing, and then one of them gets a patent, the other 5 labs, they put a lot of effort in, but they don't get the value at the end. So there can be kind of a congestion or duplication externality in innovation as well. That's another way of just saying it's extremely complicated. Okay, so when you look at anything like an iPhone, you can quickly just realize that how am I going to come up with the social returns to that, or computers, or the internet, or electricity, or the Human Genome Project? It's really hard. The other problem is that if you're trying to get social returns from society's point of view, you can't just pick the winners. Everything I just mentioned, those are all winners. Those are innovations that worked. But maybe a lot of innovation investments are complete failures. In fact, we tend to think that most innovation investments do fail. And so if we only pick the winners, we're going to get an overly rosy picture of what the returns are to innovation investments, to science, to new venture creation, et cetera. Okay, so what this paper is about is it's an attempt to kind of cut through or pass that huge challenge and introduce a new and really very simple method for calculating the overall social returns of innovation to society, to begin to assess whether we do anywhere near enough of it or too much or whatever else. Okay, so how do we do that in this paper? Well, the kind of thought experiment and the trick is, first of all, for the benefit side, to look at the overall outcome. So in particular, well, we'll look at health in the paper as well, ignore health for simplicity. Just think about the path of GDP per capita, right? So that's the total output of, say, the US economy per person, okay? And if that's going up, right, then there's value added. There's more value per person and per worker than there used to be across all the things that we do. So Amazon, if it was just stealing business from bookstores, it wouldn't cause GDP to go up. It would just relabel GDP as Amazon's created versus Barnes and Noble, okay? But if GDP goes up, then we have a net positive effect. So the idea is that by looking at GDP per capita, you net out all these really complicated spillover margins and get kind of the net effect of innovation as a whole, okay? And then separately, we can look as a whole across, say, the US economy and look at the entire cost of all innovation investment. And so that's going to be all that we put into it. So it's going to be not just the successes, but all the failures too. All the money we spent on it, that's the cost. And then the GDP per capita gain, that's the gain. Relate those two together and you're going to get a simple baseline calculation that's very transparent, as I'll show you in a second. And also you can easily edit it. You yourself could take the results of this paper and go make your own calculations, which I would encourage you to do if you're so inclined. So I'm going to sort of show you that baseline calculation, then I'm going to generalize it. The paper is quite a long paper. It generalizes in many possible ways. I'm just going to show you a few prominent ones together this afternoon. And then I'm going to come at the end to the distinction between what's the average return to what society does in innovation versus the marginal return. But let me not talk about that right now. I'll come back to that at the end. All right, so here's the key thought experiment for this paper, okay? And let's take it in sequence. So the top, let me bring up a pointer. Hold on 1 second. So this top panel up here, this is cost, okay? So X over Y is the investment cost totally in the United States put into innovation. So maybe you think this is something like R&D costs, which I'll come to, like the total R&D expenditure in the United States in a year would be X, and Y would be total GDP of the US economy. All right, so X over Y is the share of all of our output that we put into, say, R&D, for example, okay? And what I want you to imagine is, what if we just didn't do it for a year? So we kind of going along, typically it's about 2.7% of GDP is invested in R&D, and we just for 1 year, 2021, stop. And then on January 1st, 2022, we started up again. And we undertake all the same projects we were ever going to do. We just kind of didn't do it for a year and then picked up where we left off. Okay. Well, then you would not spend X over Y, X% of GDP, okay, this year if you just stopped. Okay. All right. So what would happen in the economy to GDP per capita? Well, economists, for a lot of reasons we can go into in Q&A, think of in the United States economy that innovation is what drives increases in income per capita. All right. In other words, if we just had the fixed set of ideas, imagine we had all the ideas we have right now and we have no better ones. We just have what we already know. Well, we would sort of do things the way we know how to do them. And income per capita would just be the same in the future. We would just have the same income per capita. So if we want to have higher income per capita, we have to kind of come up with new ways of doing things. All right. So in other words, if G, now look at the second panel, is the growth rate, which is sort of like 2% per year, what we would think is that if we stopped innovating entirely, the growth rate, instead of being 2%, would sort of fall to 0 while we weren't innovating. And then once we started innovating again, it would start going again. Okay. All right. Now, but here's the key thing, because when you come up with calculus or you come up with Taq polymerase, it's useful kind of across the future stream of output, right? If we advance all of our ideas at a cost of X over Y for a year, we're G% richer forever, basically. We would just be that much better off because we have that many better ideas. All right. So in other words, in the last panel here, I'm showing you income per capita, which is rising at a rate G in logs. So this is this green line, that's income per capita. And what I'm imagining is in this year, 2020, we didn't innovate at all. We saved some money because we didn't do any R&D. And then a year later, we started up all those projects again. And what we're going to do then is continue on just a year. We're going to get to the same place in per capita income. It's all the same ideas and innovation. We just get there a year later at every point in the future. All right. And so that means that we're sort of G% poorer forever if we don't innovate this year. And what's the value of G being G% poorer forever? So that's a present value calculation in economics. We take G for every stream in the future, which would be infinity unless we discounted it. So we have to add it up by discounting the future and caring a bit less about every future year. And we discount at the rate R, which is like the interest rate in the economy. So G over R is the present value of that future benefit. Okay, so that's the thought experiment. So what do you get? Well, think of rho as the ratio of the social benefit in dollars, say, or whatever, to the social costs of innovation. The investment cost is X over Y. So that's like R&D, say 2.7% of GDP. And what's the benefit? Well, you get a growth, 1 year of growth, say 1.8%, but sort of forever, and that's sort of divided by R. And interest rates are like, say, 5%. Okay, so you might be sort of making this benchmark calculation in your head, and I'll show it to you in a second, but it should be becoming clear that this is a really big number. Okay, if all of innovation costs are R&D costs, the return on it is incredibly high. Okay, if actually innovation goes way beyond what we actually formally spend in R&D, and there's like lots and lots of other costs, well, then the rate, there's more cost down here, so the benefit ratio from benefit to cost is going to go down. But under sort of any plausible version of that, as I'll sort of indicate to you, it's still really high. Maybe not as high, but it's still high. Okay, so to start with, so this is the kind of key calculation, the ratio of benefits to costs that come sort of on net across all the spillovers, intertemporal or otherwise, business dealing or otherwise, from all of innovation across the entire economy. So the kind of long run G number, we grow at about 1.8% per year in real terms over the long run. And our long run R&D spend is about 2.7% of GDP. That's pretty consistent over many decades, these numbers go. So what do you get? Well, and then it depends what R you take. But let's say we took R, it's 5%. All right, so that's like a standard discount rate. That's the kind of discount rate that a government would use to sort of think about policy, how to discount the future. Like the US government. So if you did that, you take 1.8%, divide it by 5%, and then the denominator is 2.7%. So that's the ratio of 13. What does that mean? It means that for every $1 we spend on average in R&D, we're getting $13 of benefits. So it's like, if you want, this is a machine, innovation is a machine. I put in $1, I get $13 back, right? That's an incredible investment. There's no other investment like that. It's insanely high, okay? So in other words, this simple thought experiment and calculation suggests that the average return to science and R&D and all the kind of innovation we do of R&D is absurdly high. Okay, interesting. All right. Now that would indicate that our business is a pretty good business to be in, at least from society's point of view, because the benefit is enormous. Now, what would be problems with that? Okay, that was very simple. So the rest of this paper, the paper introduces that, and the rest of the paper is trying to say, well, how would you correct this in any number of different dimensions? And if this kind of ratio is the $13 ratio with, say, a 5% discount rate, we could put a corrective factor beta in front of it and ask what would make you correct that number in which direction. All right. So there are a number of reasons to think that beta might be less than 1. That is, the number I gave you, 13, is too high. All right. And why would it be high? Well, one issue is lags. I just assumed in my thought experiment that if we don't innovate this year, kind of the growth happens right away. Right. But you might think that actually the R&D we do now pays off at some point in the future. And we have to discount that. We don't actually get these benefits right away, they come later. So it's going to make them less valuable in today's terms. A second thing is that you might think that, R&D produces ideas, but actually in order to make use of them, you actually have to like build capital equipment that makes use of them, right? And I'll talk about that in a second. So for example, an iPhone is an idea, and it's not just an idea in Steve Jobs and Apple's head. You actually have to go build these, and that's expensive. So to actually make them useful to society, you have to take the ideas and embody them in a lot of capital equipment, which is an additional expense that I'm not counting with R&D. So maybe that matters. And then it might think that a bunch of innovation doesn't happen through formal R&D processes. Maybe it comes from somewhere else. So you want to contend with that. On the other hand, so all of these things would suggest that my $13 number was too high. On the other hand, there are actually good reasons to think it might be too low, simultaneously going the other way. And one is that when I said growth is 1.8%, it's well known among economists that we are vastly typically overstating the inflation rate. All right, I'll come back to that. And that means growth is probably actually higher than I said. It's probably higher than real terms of 1.8%, which means that the benefits from innovation are even greater. Another issue is that GDP per capita leaves some things out, obviously. To a non-economist, you might already be like, why is he using GDP per capita? Well, to an economist, it's very natural as an index for sort of productivity and standards of living. But of course, one of the main reasons we do R&D is health, COVID, pandemic, and everything else, cancer, heart disease, et cetera. And a lot of innovation, a lot of R&D is targeted to health. If I included that, there'd be a whole nother set of benefits that I'm not even including, for example. And then of course, there's large international spillovers. Like what happens in the US, like if you innovate a smartphone or a COVID vaccine, it can spill over eventually across the world and provide all sorts of benefit beyond what we capture, say, in US health or US GDP. And so that would also suggest we might be greatly understating the actual social benefits from a worldwide perspective. Okay, so let me take a couple of minutes to look at the baseline being why my $13 might be too high, kind of with the issues I just raised, and then I'll go the other way for a minute as well. So, all right, so just to make an example of this, and I'll go back to the one I started with, let's go to Taq polymerase, okay? So what's going on there? All right, so in 1969, you start with two biologists from Indiana University tromping around in hot springs in Yellowstone National Park over here, and they discover these bacteria that amazingly can live in incredibly high heat water, like so a so-called extremophile bacteria. Okay, that's 1969. Okay, so that's just kind of a basic science discovery, almost a curiosity. Why would that have any practical application? Well, 7 years later, another team extracts from this bacterium the enzyme that allows it to replicate DNA, its own DNA, at high heat, Taq polymerase. Now, why is that important? It's important because in DNA replication, you have to heat up the DNA to kind of, I guess, denature it and then replicate it. But normal enzymes, they don't work at high heat. So this is the absolutely key insight that goes into the development of so-called polymerase chain reaction, which is going to win Kary Mullis the Nobel Prize not too much later, which allows you to take a small number of strands of DNA and blow them up to as many as you want very, very quickly at low cost. Okay, and it's the ability to replicate DNA that it drives everything in biotech, including sequencing and all these developments that we've had based on genetic understandings. So that's like one of the most fundamental technologies in the world. Now, if you look, you kind of have a basic science discovery in 1969. You're creating a sort of applied product 15 to 20 years later in the 80s. And so that's kind of the lag, right? There's a lag between when you invested in the grant that we've got these guys going around Yellowstone National Park, and then sort of when there was a benefit in health or the market. And then even conditional, of course, on coming up with the idea of polymerase chain reaction, for which Mullis will win the Nobel Prize, you still have to like actually make it feasible, which means putting it into capital equipment, which is itself expensive. And then of course, those pieces of capital equipment get more and more advanced to a modern PCR machine. All right, so that's another expense to sort of making use of this innovation. Okay, so we want to think about lags. That's kind of the upper row. And we want to think about the cost of embodying ideas in capital as additional cost to achieving the fruits, realizing the fruits of innovation. All right, so what about lags? What do we know about that? Well, we actually know quite a lot about that. So in the private sector, lags are actually very short. So a private company that does R&D to develop a new product, for a pharmaceutical, that can take a while because of regulatory approvals. But in almost all forms of R&D, it seems like the delays between R&D and actually having a product in the market are just a few years or less. And that's based on a lot of different kinds of surveys. I'm just mentioning a couple right here. So lags there aren't going to matter that much. Basic science, of course, like academic research, the lags are naturally quite a bit longer, like in the Thermus aquaticus bacterium example I just gave you. So I have a paper in Science a couple of years ago that takes every US patent and relates it back to all the prior science it cites, et cetera. If you do that, when a patent cites science as precursor knowledge, there's actually an average of a 6-year delay between the patent application and the paper. That was the publication date. So that's a somewhat longer delay. But of course, those are just the papers that are directly built on by patents. There's also other papers that are built on by papers, built on by papers, built on by patents. And so that was just a longer sort of lag time for other forms of science. There's a paper by Adams, which suggests maybe that's 20 years on average, between scientific insight and sort of marketplace application. These are but somewhat debated numbers. The point is, though, if you take these numbers, you can work them into our model, and you would say, okay, well, let's imagine we don't spend the R&D later and today, but the cost we, in terms of productivity gains or health gains is delayed because really there's a 20-year lag between cost and benefit. If you do that, it's going to knock down the present value of the benefit from your innovation investment, but it's still going to be huge. When you start with $13 per dollar, this, even with a 20-year delay, you're going to get down to like $5 of benefit per dollar. So it's still like an incredible machine. You put in $1, now you get $5 back in present value. That's a trade everyone would want to take. Okay, what about capital equipment? Now here we have to go into some more economics and more economic reasoning, but there's some cost of investment. Investment in the economy as opposed to consumption is the building of capital equipment. Most of it is just replacing what we already have, like depreciation of it. You have to get a new car because your old car broke. And then some of the capital investment is actually a deepening of capital. There's more capital embodying the new ideas. And so you have to account for that. And if you do that, and I'll just point out this number, I won't go into the details unless you have questions. This is going to take it from $13, say, down to $4 per dollar. Okay. And that's if I'm including kind of basically now I'm including the cost of innovation is not just R&D, it's basically all the investment we do. Okay. You're still at a big number, $4 per dollar. Looks very worthwhile. Okay, now all of that to say that you can knock the number down, but you're not knocking it down to like $1 for dollar or less than $1 for dollar. You're knocking it down to still like a really great return on the dollars that we put in. And then, as I alluded to before, there are lots of reasons to think that this baseline might actually be too low from other forces. So one was inflation that I mentioned, right? So how do we do inflation statistics? Like, how do we know how much we grow in a year? We kind of know how much we produce, but we have to sort of relate it. We have to deal with the fact that prices are going up, and what we really want to know is, like, are we producing more stuff per person, or are we just paying more for stuff? If there's inflation, we're not better off. We're just paying more for stuff. So the economists have to take out the inflation and calculating our actual real gain in the economy and standards of living. And so we do that whole. It's a big sausage making routine, and it's really hard in and of itself. So you should be skeptical of what you read in the papers. But we tended to think for a long time, 50 years or more, that there's a systematic bias where the inflation numbers we say it's 2%. Actually, it's probably more like 1%. And the reason is we don't know the way you do inflation is you follow like a given shoe over time and you look how its price changes. And that's easy to do. If the price of shoes is going up, then that's inflation. The problem is that we're constantly, through innovation, introducing new products like a smartphone, which didn't really replace, there was no prior smartphone. So it's hard to know what the price, how do you deal with the price of the initial smartphone? It's coming in. Once you have one, you can track its price, but the introduction of new goods, innovations, or large quality improvements in existing goods mess up our ability to sort of track prices over time because these things are new. And so we just don't account for that. And that seems to bias inflation statistics quite considerably. So, taking various kinds of government commissions over time, a classic one is going to suggest it's in this range down here. That's the famous Boston Commission. But this is the inflation bias. How many percentage points we're off. If you took even a conservative number, say we think we're only 0.8% too high when we talk about inflation, that's going to elevate my corrective factor to another 40%. So now you're at like $19 of benefit per dollar of expense, right? So of course, in the end, you're going to want to combine various considerations at the same time. But what you're beginning to see, I hope, is that you're going to end up kind of at a big number, however you do this, because of all these other considerations. Okay, so the end result of all of that is to say that the social returns look really, really high. And so you'll be tempted to then say, okay, so we should do a lot more of it. Okay, but not so fast. You have to be a little more careful, as economists tend to do. And economists always say you want to think on the margin. And the issue is that what we're looking at here in this calculation is all that we already do. We're looking at, here's the great return we get from all the R&D and other investments that are related to innovation that we already do. That average return of what we already do is not necessarily the same of what we get if we did $1 more, right? Often you might think, well, we did the good stuff, so maybe the next dollar isn't going to be such a high return. We've already kind of like chosen the good projects we know about, and we don't want to do anymore. So then the question is, what is the difference potentially between the average return that we're calculating and what the marginal return might be for, like, say increasing the size of the NSF, increasing investment in new venture creation, these kinds of things. And of course, policy is especially interested in that marginal return, right? Because we kind of do what we do. So if you're going to change policy, we're talking not about all of what we do, we're talking about on the margin. So for example, Chuck Schumer and others have introduced a bill, the Endless Frontiers Act, which is supposed to double the size of the NSF. And the question would be, well, what would be the return to that be? So how would you get at that? And is the marginal return far apart from the average return that we've calculated? Well, there's a variety of reasons we can talk more about that suggest that the answer is they're probably fairly similar. The marginal return is going to be a little lower, but it's probably only a little bit lower. And why would we say that? Well, first, point one here is a pure empirical point, because in narrower contexts where you don't try to study the whole thing together, people have looked a lot at, say, business R&D and what happens when business R&D goes up and down to the productivity of the firm and to its neighboring firms. They look for spillovers more in an industrial network. And you tend to find extremely high marginal social returns there. Those are empirical studies that are about these marginal changes up or down. And those numbers actually in that narrower context, which misses all of basic research and everything else, but in that narrower industrial context, comes up with numbers that are not too different from what we're seeing in our calculation. In other words, extremely high. Another reason, sort of more just sort of conceptually, to think that the returns on the margin might be high, and especially as you go more towards basic research, is because we have, the uncertainty in innovation is so enormous, right? Especially early stage. We have no idea what's going to work. You're kind of stumbling around in the dark. And so, there's lots of reason to think that to some extent, stumbling around a bit more in other rooms in the dark would be sort of similar to the rooms we're stumbling around in. We know that innovations are hard to predict and insights come from unexpected places. And we see a lot of studies showing that you kind of have these spillovers are very unexpected in unexpected directions. So that's another reason. The third reason is you could actually run a model more formally of the economy with regard to parameters that try to represent various kinds of forces here. And that would get us into the whole literature of growth in economics, and it gets us into a much more technical presentation, which I'm not going to do. Basically, growth models in economics are just differential equations where you're sort of the change in output over time as a function of various inputs, kind of a lot of inputs that go into innovation, and there's this outcome, which is output per capita, and then there's a sort of, you can solve those differential equations in a model, and then you can use various kind of empirical observations about the economy, try to pin down the parameters in those functional forms, et cetera, and then kind of get to a relationship between the average and the marginal returns. And so we actually do that in the paper as well, using the kind of canonical approaches that we know from economics. And then we can actually more formally say that, yes, the marginal returns are lower, but they're not that much lower in line with some of this other evidence. Okay, so the marginal returns also appear high. So that says, okay, now we should be investing more in R&D. We as a society seem to be kind of leaving a lot of enormous benefit on the table. We're doing great with what we've got. There's a huge return to it, but it seems like if we did some more, we would be growing faster. We'd be living longer lives, healthier lives. We'd have better solutions faster to things like the pandemic, et cetera. Okay, so what does that mean in policy? So I actually have a new, if you're interested in the subject from a sort of policy, economic reasoning point of view, I have a new book coming out called Innovation in Public Policy. It's an edited volume I've done with Austin Goolsbee, where we got contributions from a number of economists who study these issues in great detail, talking about sort of the opportunities to increase or improve the innovation ecosystem on a number of dimensions. But among them, basic research. We could do like this NSF plan. You could do a lot more money in basic research. There's more subtle issues around how you design grants. We have lots of research about that suggests that we can maybe improve on grant design. We can maybe improve on tech transfer, commercialization out of universities and other things. There's business level incentives, right? So a lot of important innovations happening in the markets, and we have, say, R&D tax credits that are very important and seem like they're quite effective in creating more, pulling forward more innovation investment in the private sector. New venture creation, of course, and that's a mix of venture capital, but also quite a bit of state and local policy as well as federal policy can influence that. And then, also very important, we don't want to lose sight of is human capital. There's good evidence, by the way, that, there's some evidence, if you were to increase your spend in R&D, like on science and the NSF, et cetera, in the short run, what's going to happen? Well, you and all of us are going to do better because we're going to get bigger grants and we might get paid more. But it's kind of hard. You need to also, if you want more innovation, you don't want to just raise the prices of what you pay for the people doing innovation. You want to get more innovation, which means you more people. And of course, the supply of people who are with PhDs and sort of who are ready to do, say, basic science and other things is in the short run fairly limited. So you have to be pretty careful that you're also not just extending what you spend on R&D, but you're also extending the labor supply of inventive and innovative scientific labor. And that really gets into education policy, immigration policy. Those things have to work in some consistent way with the spend, at least in the short run, to bring more R&D in a quantity sense, more breakthroughs, not just higher payment for the breakthroughs we're getting. Okay. Overall, what does this paper say? What does it not say? It says that, given there's these really high social returns overall, a broad increase, kind of a radial expansion of everything we're doing would seem to make sense. It would raise living standards further and faster, okay, and considerably. This suggests, innovation really kind of appears as the world's sort of biggest market failure. We seem to do far too little of it, even in the United States, where we do relatively a lot compared to many other countries. Now, this work, its strength, that it sort of works because it pulls everything together into one pot, the entire innovation ecosystem. But its strength is also a weakness. It doesn't tell us what the relative return is to sort of basic science versus applied science versus R&D conducted by corporations versus new ventures. It doesn't unpack that, right? So you have to look at other work to try to unpack that. But what I want to say is, I might say, well, I don't know what policy to do then because I don't know which one's the best. But I just want to emphasize that we have to make decisions under uncertainty. And so what I would say to that is, that would be great if we knew and we could figure that out, but we don't know the answer to that really as well. So let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If we just did more of what we're doing and then we should get a really high return overall, and we don't have to know exactly what's best. If we did know what was best, we do even better, but we're going to do well just doing more of what we're doing and not waiting for some kind of certainty in policy to justify any action at all, okay? It's an important point in these debates, not to get bogged down in sub-debates when the thing staring you in the face is, wow, there's a high return overall to what we're doing, and why aren't we doing more? Okay, so to bring things to a close, this is a question, what are the social returns to innovation? Again, we know it's valuable, but like, how does this value compare to how much we spend on it? We have to look at its value compared to its cost. So I've introduced an approach that I hope you found transparent even for non-economists. It's sort of a thought experiment. It's complementary to other approaches in the prior literature. It focuses on the overall average, benefit, the total gain from all of our innovation and the total cost of all of that, takes the ratio, and it looks like a very big number. It also allows extensions to many first order issues. I talked about lags. I talked about investing in capital equipment and that being important. I talked about inflation bias. I didn't talk about a lot of other things like international spillovers or health benefits, but that's all in the paper if you want to go look at it. It's on my website at Kellogg. And the findings are basically, even under conservative assumptions, it seems hard to get average returns that are very small. I mean, you should do it if it were $1.50 a benefit for $1, you'd do it, right? I mean, that's a great return, but we're talking like $4 or $5 even under conservative assumptions. And if you do middle of the road estimates, bringing in some of the things we're leaving out on either side, $10 per dollar looks like a plausible kind of middle of the road estimate. And the marginal returns are maybe lower than that, but they're not that much lower than that. So you're still looking on the margin at like, really large benefits to additional innovation investment. So we need more McCormicks. We need bigger McCormicks. We need more Northwesterns. We need bigger Northwesterns. And we need, not just in academics, of course, we need more going on throughout society in an innovation sense. And I look at this, just a last comment. I mean, looking back through history, obviously something very distinct happened around the Industrial Revolution with a structural break in standards of living, where we started getting a lot richer faster, and we started living a lot longer faster, and having many fewer of our children die before the age of 1, et cetera, et cetera. And we've had these incredible benefits and a structural break in history. And increasingly in a knowledge-intense environment where we know that expertise takes time to develop, et cetera, and it's really and the problems we're confronting are technically challenging and hard problems. We should recognize that why aren't we going faster? And the fact that we aren't going faster means that even right now, because we didn't go faster in the past, because we've been doing 2.7% for so long, we should be living longer today. We should be richer today. We should have had a solution for the pandemic much faster than we could because of what we haven't done in the past. So it's not that just it's your standard of living is at stake here, and I think as a society, there's just enormous opportunity to do more. And this kind of analysis in this paper hopefully helps you think in that way to some extent and begin to see why that is true or appears true. Okay, so let me stop there. I think Julio, you're going to do Q&A. Is that correct?
Yes, I will handle the questions in here, and there are some common elements in here. One question that appears in here is, how does one rationalize or address the eventually crossover innovations, in the sense that the core of innovations is influenced by development in unrelated fields? I know that in the past, you didn't get into this when you put the 3 examples. You put the Einstein's equations of relativity on the left in the screen. And you have discussed how that, without that, we wouldn't have GPS, for example. Yeah. So do you want to make some comments about that? Because I know that you have looked at that in detail.
Yeah, that's actually a fun example. Let me give that example, and then I'll maybe address, I think, what is the broader theme as I understood it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a fun example because if you could argue, look at general relativity, you might say, well, does that even, like, what is the practical application of general relativity? Obviously, very important in cosmology and sort of understanding, but where are we in terms of practical application, right? Well, it turns out, and of course, in a way, this is a story of Riemannian geometry, right? Because Einstein is able to write that equation only once he can make use of Bernard-Riemann's advances some 60, 70 years before, which themselves had seemed completely abstract and useless. And then he used the general relativity, thinking about curved spaces and higher dimensions. And then, you got general relativity. And then when you launch the GPS satellites, those are far enough up in our gravity well, and they're moving. So they have to account for special relativity and general relativity to make accurate estimates of where you are. And the reason is because the GPS work on incredibly accurate clocks, and I'm probably talking to people who know this better than I do. But it's incredibly accurate clocks, and you're comparing those clocks. But then, of course, time is moving different speeds because of gravity and speed, velocity up in space. And so the GPS satellites are actually, the clocks are pre-corrected according to Einstein relativity to give the right answer, even though they're in a different relativistic frame. And then, of course, with GPS, what do you get? Well, you get, going back to our favorite smartphone, you get Uber. You can't have all of these mobile applications without knowing where people are. So in a way, like, Uber owes a serious debt to Einstein or even Bernard-Riemann, depending on your point of view. Very long lags. Very, very interesting story. But to the broader question, I understand, Julio, we think, yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the reasons there's so much uncertainty in innovation is because things spill over in weird ways. Like AI is proving very useful in very different fields that no one, breaking through in fields that people never thought that AI would make a difference, for example. And, you might think that, well, we shouldn't try too hard right now because we have to kind of wait for these other things to happen, right? I mean, maybe the returns to doing it with our current knowledge is pretty low right now. And we're kind of waiting for a breakthrough somewhere else to suddenly make my field suddenly hot and have new opportunities. Like we had to wait for AI to get developed. And if you think, if you think about it, there's a couple things going on. One, it's absolutely true that as the state of knowledge advances overall, that opens up new opportunities, okay? And it may be the case that given the set of opportunities we have, doing more and more and more and more is sort of less return because we're kind of stuck with what we know and sort of we should just wait. You might kind of get worried about it. This gets to that question of whether the marginal return is much lower. Maybe given what we know now, having more scientists, we just do more of exactly the same projects, and it's sort of useless. which gets to the idea of, Merton multiples, the idea that, we do observe that scientists seem to discover things simultaneously, like Newton and Leibniz with calculus. Sort of almost if it's in the air and someone's going to do it, so we don't need more people, someone's going to do it, right? So if you start thinking about these issues, and actually this is a new paper that Larry Summers and I have been thinking about writing to really kind of look at that trade-off. The model I alluded to, but I'm not going to go into detail in the paper at the end, that's more technical, is exactly weighing these issues. Like what if you're fishing in a pond with not a lot of great ideas in it right now, but then, advancing ideas opens up new doors. It turns out that those are the forces that are wrestling with each other in the marginal returns calculation, and there's reasons to think that on net, it's still very useful on the margin to do more innovation.
So there are a couple of questions that have to do with G. One is, how do you account for diminishing marginal returns of innovation within the value G? And also that a key assumption seems to be that G depends or is driven completely by innovation. So could you kind of get a little bit more into that?
Yes. So if we were talking about, China and its high G, its high growth per capita income, I wouldn't particularly talk about innovation, right? So often when a developing country is growing, they're just adopting existing best practices in the world. They're getting tractors when they didn't have tractors, and building railways and planes when they didn't have those, okay? So much of growth in the world isn't happening through innovation, okay? It's actually happening through building capital accumulation, building machines and infrastructure and education. But in an advanced economy like the US, we think, and this goes back to the Nobel Prize winning ideas of Solow in the 1950s, there's diminishing returns to capital. So eventually we have a lot of education, we have a lot of machines, our farmers have tractors, we have computers, I've got one on my desk, we have buildings, etc. And we're kind of in a steady state, right? And so all modern understanding of growth in an advanced economy context like the US says that we're kind of in an equilibrium and a steady state, and we're doing what we know how to do. We're not trying to catch up to someone else's technology. We're kind of using the best technology that we know about and have implemented to the best of our ability. And so future growth is coming year to year from advancing the set of things we know how to do, getting better ideas about how to do things. Okay, and so that's sort of the way growth is written. And of course, that's the assumption in the paper, which I think if to an economist is extremely natural and builds out of a lot of research, I think to a non-economist might seem a little bit more, less obviously comfortable. But hopefully what I'm saying now gives you an idea. Just think of sort of, we have our state of knowledge. If we don't advance it, we're kind of where we are in the United States. And that's the way to think about it.
So one question here is, this is more speculation, I think, but have you sort of thought how your analysis could apply to countries that are investing a much greater percentage of the GDP on R&D? So like, I think China now. And will this analysis help to quantify the marginal return of more R&D investment?
Yeah, actually, so we haven't actually made that sort of growth calculation, but the model we have in the paper, you could say if we doubled R&D, how much faster would we grow? That number is calculatable. Again, I mean, I think some of the parameters in those functions that we need to use, I think are less well known. So you wouldn't want to pick a number that you feel super confident about, but you could sort of draw the picture with a range that you would sort of think are maybe reasonable estimates of how much growth you would get. In terms of growth, in terms of countries doing different things, I mean, again, for kind of advance at the frontier, China may be advancing at the frontier in some things, maybe in AI, maybe in, drones. They're good at drones, DJI, for example. But traditionally, we're thinking about, a Germany, a Japan, Switzerland. We're thinking about countries that are at the highest per capita income levels, and like the US, are kind of not going to advance further. They kind of implement what they know, and they need to kind of know new things to go further. Whereas China still has enormous opportunity, certainly in its interior, for example, to do basic, getting tractors to farmers, just bringing practices up to the world frontier through capital investment. and human capital. Right? Education levels in China remain really low. I mean, not in the major cities. There's an incredibly large number of really incredibly talented and highly trained people coming from China, but in the interior of the country, education rates are very, very low. So there's a lot of room then for them to use education and capital investment. But yeah, so but even Japan and China, Japan and Germany, which I'd single out, have slightly higher GDP R&D rates out of GDP, maybe like 3% instead of 2.7% of the U.S. In general, countries in the G7 or the OECD are at even lower rates than the U.S. So there is plenty of room for anyone to up their game. Interesting sort of policy debates about, am I just benefiting the rest of the world, or how much am I benefiting my own country, because ideas spill over across borders. But you seem to get a lot of benefits locally, so it would seem like a sensible policy, even narrowly thinking about national self-interest, to expand along these lines.
So there is a question in here that has to do with the burst of innovation now that has taken place with the development of the coronavirus vaccines. The speed of the development that many people were surprised on how fast this occurred. Can you speculate on how, you made some comments about pharmaceutical companies somewhere in the talk, but will this spill over in some way, in a positive way for humankind?
Sure. I mean, where would we be if we weren't mRNA vaccines? If there hadn't already been research that teed up the approach that's proven effective in shorter amounts of time with Moderna and Pfizer. This is the same sense. If we're stuck going into a crisis with the knowledge we have, and it's hard to come up with all the insights we need at the moment. So you kind of go to, I think the COVID situation is actually a great microcosm of everything I'm saying at a narrower level. All right. So, we're all really impressed that, instead of 5 years, say, we got vaccines within the year. Okay. But think about the cost benefit analysis here. I mean, we're talking let's say it's a $10 trillion, $15 trillion loss in the world economy, or just take the US, which, has spent $3 trillion out of the federal budget combating the symptoms of the crisis through stimulus payments. Okay. Operation Warp Speed is the teeniest fraction of that. It's something like $20 billion. It's basically nothing. Okay. So just think about, if you you spend $20 billion, you're trying to avoid $15 trillion in damages. If we could the world is losing, $10 billion a day in GDP, not to mention all the death. Okay. Just the GDP is $10 billion a day. If you could spend another $10 billion, which would be like a 50% increase in Operation Warp Speed, and all that did was bring the end of the crisis one day forward, that pays for itself.
Wow.
So that's whether that's now the manufacturing you need to do, or it was the initial insights on the vaccines and the testing. Our level of effort has been so poor compared to the costs we're bearing as a society, and it's even worse than the numbers I'm telling you in that sense. And these are the questions. We need to be further ahead in our knowledge. We need to understand that this is the key. We have to invest in it to solve the problems that face society. And I think we seem like we do a lot, or do we? Are you impressed with what we did? You should be much less impressed than one might think.
So the question is, and a lot of the burden fall on us, people in science and engineering, which were not especially adept at explaining these things. And is there any way that some of these concepts, even in a very dilute way, could reach the public at large? Because the truth is that, the people who read the Economist get these things, and maybe the Financial Times, and maybe the Wall Street, okay? But the vast majority of people don't understand any of these things. Even us, many people in science and engineering understand, and we have a concept that, innovation is good, but we don't have really good arguments to explain why it's good. So are you optimistic at all that at some point, some of these things will reach the broader public at large? or if you have ideas on how these things can be explained.
I actually am optimistic. Actually, it's probably worth saying a little backstory of this paper, because so I was working in the Obama administration in the first term, as was Larry, who was the director of the National Economic Council. Actually, the idea for this paper was born in a conversation at that time in his office. We were chatting, and because let me give you an example of what you're saying, Julio. Like, so in the Obama administration, it's very evidence oriented. People are very pro innovation, and you think, okay, this is an easy case to make. But I would be debating with other people in the White House, and they would say, but I mean, isn't most of like academic research useless, and like, doesn't it all fail? And I'd be like, what about monoclonal antibodies? And I whip out an anecdote from like the NIH portfolio or something, and they're like, yeah, but what about all this other stuff? And so kind of in a way, the idea of this paper is to ask that question. On average, what's the return? Yeah, there's sure a lot of failures, but what's the return? It's the other version of this is Solyndra. The U.S. invested in Solyndra, and it was a huge waste of money. And it's like, okay, fine, but innovation fails. We don't want to argue on anecdotes. And so what hopefully this does is it allows me to go back into those conversations on an evidence basis, and and say, well, these are this is what a more average number looks like, and it looks pretty good. I actually think, and then last comment on that, I actually think one can be fairly optimistic, because although we live in a troubled time in American politics and policy making, more than we're used to, certainly, innovation is at least traditionally a bipartisan affair. I mean, there's a reason the NIH gets funded, the NSF gets funded, and it's because growth-oriented Republicans and Democrats sort of want growth, and they get that, and they want better health, and they get that this stuff matters. They don't know how much it matters, and they'll debate, and they'll get annoyed by seemingly foolish projects, but they also want it to work, and they get its importance. And so, unlike many issues, it traditionally has not been any kind of wedge issue, and hopefully that can continue, because I think that means with some evidence, the opportunity to do more is good. And I define this NSF expansion, doubling it as Chuck Schumer's bill. It's actually, I think, with Portman, it's co-sponsored. It's a bipartisan bill. Forgive me for not remembering the other senator or senators who are involved with it, but so I think there is opportunity, and I think we have to just communicate.
Maybe a way to start will be to educate more our students in science and engineering about this. So, but a related question that maybe will come from the other side is, how do you think about inequality in this? So, for example, many innovations increase per capita GDP, but the things kind of bifurcate, and median income can or could go down. Yeah. So I'm sure you get a lot of questions about that inequities.
Absolutely. And that, of course, is the other great dimension of political discourse, right? This was all written about the total pie, with no attention to the in the paper to the shares of the pie. And since the 1970s in the U.S., there's been quite a bit of concern that median household wages have stagnated, and that may be also part of the political challenges we face within this country. And that could be related to innovation in the sense that automation or whatever else has bias. We think of innovation in general, economists do, as being skill biased, that over time it has raised the returns to higher education compared to lower education. But if you look at that, and I think that's probably going to continue to be the case, but if you look at that, the other way to say that puzzle is, given that the returns to higher education have gone up so much, the returns to human capital investment have never been higher. You hear things about tuition costs, it's just totally missing the point. The net of tuition costs, it's never been a better deal on average to get higher education in terms of your wage growth. The puzzle is, why don't more people go to college, right? And get these jobs. Not everyone has to. So remember, in economics, if we just move some of the labor supply that was less educated, say high school educated, into college educated, there would now be fewer less than college educated people, and because they are scarce, their labor supply is scarce, the services they provide are scarce, their wages will go up too. All right, so you don't have to become college educated to benefit. As the whole economy, if we just move more people into this sort of innovation engine of higher education, everybody's going to benefit. And so to me, rather than sort of stopping the innovation, I would say let's work on that. And I think there's enormous opportunity to do that. And that's not just a matter of inequality, and it's not just a matter of growth in the overall economy. It's also, of course, a matter of individual opportunity. I mean, I think we know that there's enormous talent among young people, particularly from underrepresented groups, who do not migrate into these innovation careers. And we know from their test scores and things at younger ages that they're as good, they're there, but for a variety of reasons that we're starting to understand and unpack, they kind of fall off that career path. And one way to extend this human capital is both an individual opportunity, solving inequality, and accelerating improvements in health and standards of living is exactly solving that human capital challenge.
Fantastic. Ben, again, many, many thanks for having done this talk for us. And let me just repeat this. One of the greatest benefits of being in a complete university is that there are people within the ecosystem like Ben, and understanding how they think about issues that we normally don't think much is fantastic for our growth. Is not using the opportunity of benefiting from one's colleagues is really a lost opportunity. Ben, many thanks again. Fantastic talk. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the invitation. My pleasure. And I hope that was clear, and hope we can talk about it further
it was
some point in
fantastic.
person or otherwise.
Especially the little figures. I did not know that economists will use arguments as clear as that. Fantastic. Thank you.
Very good. Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.